He walked into the courtroom quietly, carrying nothing but a small leather notebook and the steady calm his grandmother taught him to hold on to. At just 17, Marcus looked like any other black teenager. At least that's what the judge decided the moment their eyes met. A faint smirk tugged at the judge's mouth, the kind that wasn't just dismissive. It was insulting. Marcus felt the weight of every stare, every assumption settling onto his shoulders. He wasn't even there as a defendant, but the room treated him like one. And what the judge said next, it made the entire courtroom shift. If only they knew who Marcus really was. Marcus had always been quiet, thoughtful, and observant. Traits his grandmother used to tell him were gifts most people don't appreciate until they need them. At 17, he carried himself with a calm beyond his years. He wasn't tall, and he didn't try to seem older than he was. His strength was quieter, seen in the steadiness of his eyes, the patience in his breathing, and the way he listened before speaking. He grew up on the east side of Raleigh, in a neighborhood where children learned early which streets to avoid and which adults they could trust. His mother worked double shifts at the hospital. His grandmother, Miss Hattie, raised him with stories about dignity, justice, and the long fight black families had endured to be treated as human beings. Marcus adored her. It was her old law books, faded, dusty, smelling of age and courage, that awakened something inside him. By 11, he was reading case summaries most adults never touched. By 13, he was shadowing a community attorney who saw something rare in him. And by 17, he had completed enough early college courses and mentorship hours to become a licensed junior legal assistant, one of the youngest in the state. But Marcus kept that part quiet. He didn't seek praise. What he wanted was understanding, why the world treated certain people differently, and why justice felt steady in books but slippery in real life. That morning, the sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of winter day that gave Raleigh's old buildings a solemn glow. Marcus arrived early at the courthouse, wearing a simple navy sweater and slacks that were slightly too big. He preferred blending in. His plan was to quietly observe Judge William Hanford's morning docket. Hanford had a reputation: stern, traditional, unyielding. Some called him fair. Others whispered, out of touch. A few in the community had other words for him, words that Marcus had heard too many times growing up. Inside the courtroom, rows of wooden benches lined the space. The air smelled faintly of old varnish and copier toner. Attorneys murmured to one another. A bailiff shuffled paperwork. Marcus took a seat near the front, opening his worn notebook. He planned to quietly observe, nothing more. But even before the judge entered, Marcus felt eyes on him. A few people glanced at him with that familiar mixture of surprise and suspicion. Surprised he was alone, suspicious he didn't fit. He kept his gaze lowered. When Judge Hanford finally stepped through the chamber door, the room rose. His black robe hung stiffly from his shoulders. His face carried the expression of a man who believed every second of his time was more important than anyone else's. As he settled into his seat, his gaze swept across the room and stopped when it reached Marcus. A pause, a tightening of the jaw, a curl at the corner of the judge's mouth. Marcus felt that look like a cold tap on the back of his neck. It wasn't new, he'd grown up with it, but it still stung. He remained still, closing his notebook gently. Hanford leaned forward. "Young man," he said, voice echoing through the quiet room, "are you in the right place?" A few people turned their heads. The question wasn't friendly. It wasn't even curious. It was a warning dressed as concern. Marcus lifted his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm here to observe." The judge chuckled, actually chuckled. "Observe? This is a courtroom, not a school field trip." His tone made the small crowd shift uncomfortably. Marcus felt his pulse steady, the way it always did when something unfair was unfolding. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and closed his notebook again. But beneath that calm exterior, something was building. Something the judge couldn't see. Something he wasn't ready for. Because soon, the courtroom would learn exactly why Marcus had come, and why he didn't deserve the look the judge had given him. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the morning docket progressed. Marcus sat silently, letting every word of every case wash over him. A few attorneys paused to glance at him, curious, then dismissed him with polite nods. To most, he was just another teenager in the gallery, a black boy sitting too close to the front. That perception, so common, was exactly what Marcus had come to witness. The first case was a traffic violation. The driver, a middle-aged black man, fumbled through explanations as the prosecutor leaned over the table, his voice sharp, impatient. Marcus noticed the subtle shift in tone, the way the bailiff's hand lingered over the man's shoulder, the barely hidden smirk of one of the jurors. Small things, easy to miss if you didn't know to look. But Marcus noticed everything. And then it happened. A young woman, no older than 20, was brought in for a minor dispute over a lease. She spoke nervously, her hands twisting in her lap. Judge Hanford, who had barely looked at her before, raised an eyebrow and sighed audibly. "Young lady, I've heard enough. This is a courtroom, not a playground. You'll either speak clearly, or I'll hold you in contempt." The words were sharp, cutting, almost designed to embarrass. Marcus felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He recognized it, the way authority could twist words into a weapon, how it could make ordinary people shrink. He thought of his grandmother, of the countless lessons she had drilled into him about dignity, about patience, about knowing the rules before challenging the system. He wrote notes in his notebook, careful, precise. Then Judge Hanford's eyes shifted to him. That smirk again, the one that had made Marcus feel small when he first entered. "And you, boy," the judge said, voice dripping condescension. "Are you planning to take notes, or just stare like the rest of the children in this room?" A few people chuckled softly. Marcus's face remained calm, but his mind raced. He could see the assumptions forming, that he was uneducated, naive, maybe even incapable of understanding the law. The room believed it, and to them, he belonged in a gallery, not anywhere near the bench or a legal argument. But Marcus had prepared for this. He waited, letting the judge speak, letting the moment stretch. Every second was a beat in a rhythm Marcus knew well. He had studied these interactions, practiced patience, calculated timing. Then, as the judge continued to belittle another young defendant, Marcus spoke. His voice calm, steady, precise. "Your Honor," he began, and the courtroom shifted. Conversations halted. Heads turned. The air seemed to compress around the sound of his voice. "If I may." Hanford looked down, puzzled. "Who are you?" Marcus rose, slowly, deliberately, and placed his notebook on the bench. "I am Marcus Johnson, licensed junior attorney. I am here under the mentorship program to observe courtroom procedure, not as a defendant, but as an official participant in the legal system." For a beat, the room held its breath. The judge's smirk faltered, replaced by something tighter, less confident. "A what?" Marcus continued, undeterred. He explained his training, his mentorship, the early college credits, and the legal hours he had already completed. Each word was measured, each pause intentional, letting the room absorb the reality. The murmurs turned into astonishment, then silence. The same people who had assumed he was just a teenager now stared at him in disbelief. The tension in the courtroom thickened. The judge, accustomed to control, felt it slipping. The power dynamic had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Marcus was no longer a subject of mockery. He was authority's mirror, reflecting back the assumptions, the biases, the unspoken prejudices that had colored every glance directed at him. And then the test came. An attorney called Marcus over to review a minor procedural error in one of the ongoing cases. The judge, now visibly unsure, watched as Marcus calmly pointed out the misstep, citing the specific code, the exact procedural rule, and the correct remedy. The room hung on his words. Each correction Marcus offered was not only accurate but delivered with the quiet confidence of someone whose legitimacy could not be questioned. A few moments later, the judge attempted to regain control, raising his gavel to speak, but Marcus anticipated the objection, addressing it with a professionalism that made the courtroom collectively lean forward in attention. Every time the judge tried to dismiss him, Marcus replied, not defensively, not arrogantly, but with a clear, calm articulation of facts. Whispers began to circulate. People in the gallery exchanged looks. Some nodded subtly, some shook their heads in disbelief. Marcus's presence had become magnetic, undeniable. The courtroom had become a stage for a quiet revelation, a confrontation of assumptions and racial bias in its purest, most subtle form. But Marcus wasn't done. He noticed small gestures, small slights, the microaggressions threaded through language, the dismissive hand motions of some clerks, the casual lowering of voices when addressing him, the tiny sidelong glances from other attorneys. He recorded everything mentally, every detail a note in the silent story of how justice was filtered through prejudice. Then, a small but critical moment arrived. A young man, accused of minor vandalism, looked terrified. Judge Hanford began lecturing him with the same condescension Marcus had endured moments before. Without raising his voice, Marcus stepped forward. "Your Honor, may I?" he asked. The judge paused, uncertain, the gavel held mid-air. Marcus carefully corrected a procedural misstatement that, if ignored, could have unfairly impacted the defendant. The courtroom went silent again. Even the bailiff seemed to hesitate, sensing the tension. The judge's earlier mockery was gone, replaced by a tight, forced neutrality. Every eye was now on Marcus. The whispers turned to murmurs of astonishment. How could this teenager be so composed, so knowledgeable, so right? It was in this stretch, this sequence of careful observation, patient endurance, and precise intervention, that Marcus revealed the truth not just about himself, but about the systemic biases that governed the courtroom. Each small act of competence was a mirror to every prejudice in the room. And the most critical moment was coming. The judge, struggling to reclaim authority, asked Marcus to sit, a warning tone hiding uncertainty. Marcus smiled faintly. He knew this was not over. The eyes that had doubted him were now watching, calculating, questioning. And he had only begun to show them what respect, knowledge, and quiet persistence could do in a room built on assumptions and bias. The courtroom was no longer just a room. It was a stage, a test, a lesson in perception and reality. Marcus had entered as a boy, underestimated and mocked. By the time the rising action reached its peak, every participant, every observer, understood one undeniable truth. They had misjudged him, entirely and because of his skin. And the moment that would truly shatter their assumptions, the climax, was just ahead. The courtroom held its breath. Even the distant hum of the heater seemed to fade, replaced by the almost palpable tension in the air. Judge Hanford's eyes flicked to Marcus, now standing at the center of the room with quiet authority, the very picture of composure. The earlier smirk, the condescension, the subtle mockery, all of it had vanished, replaced by a barely controlled unease. Marcus spoke, slow and deliberate. "Your Honor, I would like to clarify the record regarding the previous case before we proceed." His voice carried a calm certainty that contrasted sharply with the judge's sudden tightness. Every syllable was precise, measured, deliberate, a rhythm that drew every ear in the room. The judge opened his mouth, hesitated, then tried to interrupt. Marcus anticipated the objection, holding up a hand politely. "If I may finish," he said, and the room went completely silent. Even the clerks, normally typing or shuffling papers, paused. He cited the relevant legal statutes, procedural errors, and corrective steps with a depth of knowledge no 17-year-old was expected to possess. Each correction was factual, neutral, and undeniable. Hanford's hands gripped the gavel tighter. His breath, previously steady, now betrayed a hint of tension. The courtroom watched as Marcus calmly walked through the entire procedural error, showing precisely how it had affected the defendant. Every word revealed not just his mastery of law, but the reality of the assumptions that had colored the judge's first glance at him. Then Marcus paused, letting the silence stretch. It was deliberate, allowing the weight of his revelation to sink in. Every person in that room, attorneys, clerks, spectators, felt it. The boy they had dismissed, the teen they had mocked, was not just capable, but skilled beyond expectation. The courtroom held its breath. Even the distant hum of the heater seemed to fade, replaced by the almost palpable tension in the air. Judge Hanford's eyes flicked to Marcus, now standing at the center of the room with quiet authority, the very picture of composure. The earlier smirk, the condescension, the subtle mockery, all of it had vanished, replaced by a barely controlled unease. Marcus spoke, slow and deliberate. "Your Honor, I would like to clarify the record regarding the previous case before we proceed." His voice carried a calm certainty that contrasted sharply with the judge's sudden tightness. Every syllable was precise, measured, deliberate, a rhythm that drew every ear in the room. The judge opened his mouth, hesitated, then tried to interrupt. Marcus anticipated the objection, holding up a hand politely. "If I may finish," he said, and the room went completely silent. Even the clerks, normally typing or shuffling papers, paused. He cited the relevant legal statutes, procedural errors, and corrective steps with a depth of knowledge no 17-year-old was expected to possess. Each correction was factual, neutral, and undeniable. Hanford's hands gripped the gavel tighter. His breath, previously steady, now betrayed a hint of tension. The courtroom watched as Marcus calmly walked through the entire procedural error, showing precisely how it had affected the defendant. Every word revealed not just his mastery of law, but the reality of the assumptions that had colored the judge's first glance at him. Then Marcus paused, letting the silence stretch. It was deliberate, allowing the weight of his revelation to sink in. Every person in that room, attorneys, clerks, spectators, felt it. The boy they had dismissed, the teen they had mocked, was not just capable, but skilled beyond expectation. Marcus finally looked directly at Judge Hanford. "I understand your surprise," he said softly, "but it is important to remember that appearances often mislead. Authority and knowledge are not determined by age, nor should they be judged by race." The words hung in the air like a suspended note. For the first time, the judge was truly uncertain. The gavel lowered slowly, and his eyes, once brimming with superiority, now reflected the stark recognition of his bias. He had misjudged Marcus entirely, and it was clear to everyone. A murmur ran through the gallery. Some whispered apologies, others exchanged incredulous looks. The tension, previously tight as steel, shifted into a collective understanding. The assumptions, the microaggressions, the racial bias, it had been exposed. Marcus had not only defended the process. He had revealed the courtroom's invisible prejudices, its subtle hierarchy of disbelief. Then came the final, decisive moment. Marcus turned to the defendant, a young black man who had been on edge the entire morning. With the calm assurance of someone decades older, Marcus advised him on how to present his case within the correct procedural framework. He guided him through the next steps, highlighting the exact language, the exact citations, the precise motions necessary. The courtroom collectively leaned forward. The young defendant, once trembling, now looked cautiously confident. The judge, visibly humbled, paused at every intervention, clearly aware that the boy he had mocked was transforming the very course of the proceedings. Marcus's gaze swept the room, silently acknowledging the lessons he had forced everyone to confront. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was demonstrating the truth, an irrefutable fact. Intellect, skill, and moral clarity cannot be measured by age or racial bias. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, in the quietest of tones, the judge finally said, "Mr. Johnson, I underestimated you. That was wrong." His voice was tinged with both relief and regret, an admission few would ever dare speak aloud. Marcus nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, calm, firm, and composed. He returned to his seat, the weight of the morning lifted not by triumphalism, but by justice finally acknowledged. In that suspended moment, the room collectively understood something profound. The assumptions they carried, the biases so casually applied, had no place in the true pursuit of justice. Marcus had entered as a boy under scrutiny and mockery. He left that moment as a teacher, a mirror reflecting their own prejudices, and a quiet force of truth. The gavel had fallen many times that morning, but none of the strikes had echoed as loudly as the truth Marcus had revealed. Not through anger, not through spectacle, but through calm, unwavering competence and integrity. And in that pause, the lesson lingered like a shadow across the room. How many more assumptions remain unchallenged, waiting for someone to quietly expose them? The courtroom emptied slowly, the low murmur of footsteps and whispered conversations filling the space that had moments ago been thick with tension. Marcus remained seated for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around him. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady, aware of the weight of what had just occurred. The judge's earlier mockery, the hushed assumptions of the gallery, the casual prejudices of the attorneys. All of it had been exposed, but the work was far from over. Outside, the winter sunlight reflected off the courthouse steps, pale but persistent, as if to remind him that the world could be harsh. Yet clarity always found a way to shine through. Marcus's grandmother, Miss Hattie, often told him, "Strength is not in fighting the world, but in standing so steady that the world has no choice but to see you." Today, he had lived that lesson. The young defendant approached him hesitantly, eyes wide with awe. "Thank you," he said softly. I didn't think anyone would listen." Marcus smiled gently. Justice isn't about being listened to once. It's about being heard enough times to matter. The boy nodded, a spark of hope lighting his face for the first time that morning. Judge Hanford lingered behind, a figure quietly reassessing his own judgments. Marcus caught the briefest glimpse of humility in his expression, a recognition of the assumptions he had carried. The judge had been forced, by the simple truth of competence and integrity, to confront his biases. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. The man had seen, in no uncertain terms, that his authority was not immune to prejudice, and that truth, when presented with clarity, could not be denied. As Marcus walked down the steps, notebook tucked neatly under his arm, he reflected on what had truly shifted. This morning had not been about proving intelligence or skill. It had been about showing that the lens through which people judged others was often clouded by history, race, and unspoken fear. And if one person could quietly hold the room accountable, perhaps the next one could too. Back at home, Marcus set his notebook on the table and poured himself a cup of tea. The aroma of chamomile, warm and calming, contrasted with the adrenaline of the morning. His mother would ask how it went. He would tell her simply that the world had looked at him differently today. Not because he demanded it, but because he quietly showed them the truth. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread. Not as gossip, not as sensational drama, but as a quiet story of subtle triumph. Attorneys discussed it in hushed tones. The judge reflected on his approach, and members of the community shared their own stories of assumptions and surprises. Marcus's presence, once overlooked, had created a ripple far beyond the walls of that single courtroom. And yet, he remained the same calm, thoughtful young man he had always been. He didn't seek recognition. He only sought fairness, truth, and the chance to let knowledge speak louder than bias. Every time he opened his grandmother's old law books, he was reminded of the work that still needed to be done, not just in the courtroom, but in every corner of a world quick to judge based on appearances. As night fell, Marcus gazed out the window at the quiet streets. He thought of every child who had been dismissed, every young person whose potential was underestimated, every person whose dignity had been quietly eroded by prejudice. He understood that one courtroom, one morning, one act of measured courage could not change the entire system, but it could plant a seed, and sometimes that seed was enough. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his grandmother's words, of the countless others who had come before him, and of the justice still waiting to be claimed. And in that quiet reflection, a question lingered, both haunting and necessary. When we witness injustice, when we see someone dismissed, underestimated, or mocked, will we remain silent, or will we stand, calmly and resolutely, to show the truth? Marcus didn't have an answer for everyone, but he knew he had chosen his own path, and in that choice he had already begun to change the world.